My nephew, Philip, stood in the center of my library, a place he knew was my sanctuary. His smile was a venomous slash across his face. "The advance was $250,000, Uncle Michael," he said, his voice echoing off the leather-bound spines. "And that's just the start. They're projecting a seven-figure run within the first year." His lawyer, a shark in a tailored suit, stood silently by the door, a human full stop on my life's work. Philip let out a short, cruel laugh. "You see, you were just letting it rot here. I liberated it. It's my story to tell now, legally speaking." He gestured around the room at the carefully preserved family documents, the photos, the history I'd spent a lifetime curating. "This is all just a dusty old museum. The world wants digital, Uncle. The world wants a brand." The finality in his tone was like a coffin lid closing. The lawyer stepped forward, placing a glossy book proposal on my mahogany desk. The cover was a stylized photo of my father in uniform, a man Philip had barely known. My name was nowhere. In its place, discovered and edited by Philip Crane. I could see my neighbor, Mrs. Gable, peering through the window, her face a mask of pity. I was cornered in my own home, the evidence of my erasure laid out before me, witnessed by all. I didn't look at the proposal. I didn't look at my neighbor. I looked directly at Philip, my hands folded calmly on my lap. I felt a strange quiet settle over me, a clarity I hadn't felt in months. I let a small, tight smile touch my lips. He mistook my silence for defeat, his own smile widening with arrogance. The air crackled with tension. Philip's lawyer cleared his throat, ready to deliver the final procedural blow that would legally sever me from my own family's legacy. Philip leaned in, his condescending smirk twisting into a caricature of triumph, expecting me to beg, to weep, to finally break. He opened his mouth to speak, to claim his final victory. But months earlier, on a quiet Tuesday in March, it all began not with a bang, but with a simple, treacherous request. The house was always quiet after Olivia passed. The silence was a physical weight, broken only by the quiet hiss of a radiator and the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. My world had shrunk to this study, a room filled with the ghosts of my family, captured in letters, photographs, and documents. As a retired history archivist, I didn't just see paper and ink. I saw lives lived. It was my job, my purpose, to preserve them. So when my sister's boy, Philip, started visiting more often, I was grateful for the company. He'd bring coffee and we talked for hours. I even let him read passages from my father's most precious possession, his journal from the war. I thought he shared my reverence for our legacy. I saw a spark of genuine interest in his eyes, or so I believed. It felt like passing a torch, trusting him with the very soul of our family. One afternoon, I brought it out for him, not a copy, but the original. His father's handwritten journal from the Battle of the Bulge. The leather cover was worn smooth, the pages brittle and yellowed, filled with my father's cramped, precise script. It smelled of old paper, leather, and a faint, lingering trace of tobacco. "This is the heart of it all, Philip," I told him, my voice thick with emotion. "This is his testimony." Philip handled it like an artifact for a moment. Then his interest waned. He set it down with a careless thud. "It's a nice piece of family history, Uncle Mike," he said with a patronizing air. "But it's just scribbles in a book. The real value is the story itself, not this dusty old thing." He waved a dismissive hand at it, as if it were a worthless trinket. That casual disrespect should have been a screaming alarm bell. Over the next few weeks, his questions became more pointed. Not about our grandfather's feelings or his comrades, but about the market. Are there other diaries like this? How many unpublished accounts from the Bulge are out there? Is it unique? He was no longer a nephew interested in his heritage. He was a prospector, sniffing for gold. I felt a chill despite the radiator's steady hiss. The stakes were shifting from sentiment to commerce. I found myself thinking of Olivia. She had a gentle way of seeing the truth of people. She would have seen the avarice in Philip's eyes from a mile away. "Be careful, Michael," she would have whispered, placing a hand on my arm. "A man who only asks the price of a thing has forgotten its value." Her memory was a quiet compass, and in that moment, I knew Its needle was spinning wildly, warning me of a coming storm. Then came the pitch. "Uncle Mike, you need to preserve this stuff. Let me help you digitize it," Philip offered, his voice dripping with false sincerity. "We can scan the journal, transcribe it, create a proper digital archive to protect it for the future." It sounded so modern, so responsible. He framed it as an act of preservation, a noble project to safeguard our family's history from the ravages of time. It was the perfect bait. My pride in him, my desire to see the family legacy continued, blinded me. I agreed. I helped him set up a scanner on my desk, showed him how to handle the fragile pages. It felt good, collaborative. For a few weeks, my quiet study was filled with a new energy. I was the elder statesman, passing on my knowledge. I didn't realize I was not his mentor. I was his resource, and I was being mined. Once he had the complete digital copy, the visits stopped. My calls went to voicemail, and his texts became terse, one-word replies. Busy, swamped, later. The silence in the house returned, but now it was different. It wasn't peaceful, it was hollow. The ticking of the clock in the hall sounded less like the passage of time, and more like a countdown to something I couldn't yet name but deeply dreaded. The trigger came on a rainy Tuesday. I was browsing an online industry journal, a habit from my archivist days, when I saw the headline from a major New York publisher: Bedlam Ink Press acquires newly discovered World War II diary from the Battle of the Bulge. My heart seized. The description of the raw, unflinching account was my father's voice, his words, his soul. The betrayal was so profound, so public, it left me breathless. When I finally got Philip on the phone, his voice was breezy, almost giddy. There was no apology, no explanation. "Oh, it's a great opportunity, Uncle Mike. We'll be rich. I got us an incredible deal." He said us, but the press release only mentioned him. He hadn't asked. He hadn't consulted. He had simply taken my father's life and sold it to the highest bidder, as if it were a piece of furniture. I tried to protest, to explain that this was a sacred trust, not a commodity. His response was a stunning blow, delivered with the casual cruelty of the profoundly selfish. "This is an important story that deserves to be told," he snapped, his voice rising. "You were just letting it rot in that dusty room, Uncle Mike. I'm doing what you were too sentimental to do. I'm giving it a legacy." He made his theft sound like my failure. My first call was to Arthur Penwright, a probate lawyer I'd known for 30 years. We met in his quiet, wood-paneled office. After hearing the story, Arthur was indignant. "This is an open and shut case of copyright infringement and misappropriation, Michael," he assured me, his confidence a soothing balm on my frayed nerves. "He had no legal right. We'll send a cease and desist immediately." For the first time in weeks, a glimmer of false hope appeared. Arthur drafted a stern letter. The reply from Bedlam Inc.'s legal department came less than a week later. It was not a negotiation. It was a declaration of war. They were a multi-million-dollar corporation, and their response was slick, intimidating, and dismissive. They argued the journal was a family story, and Philip, as a direct descendant, had an implicit right to share it. They called my claim frivolous and without merit. The confidence drained from Arthur's face as he read their response. "Michael, these are serious people," he said, his voice heavy. "They're citing obscure precedents, twisting family law. To fight this, we'd need depositions, discovery, a trial. It would cost a fortune. They know that. They're daring us to bankrupt ourselves fighting them." The crushing defeat was swift and brutal. My glimmer of hope was extinguished. A week later, a registered letter arrived. It was a courtesy notice from the publisher's legal team, officially informing me that The Last Winter, A Soldier's Diary, was slated for publication on March 12, 2024. The ticking clock was now a thunderous boom in my ears. I had less than 3 months. They were moving forward, confident that an old man with limited resources was no threat to their bottom line. The stakes had been raised to an impossible height. The study, my former sanctuary, became my prison. Every book seemed to mock me. The smell of old paper and leather, once a comfort, now smelled like decay. like the slow death of my family's honor. I would sit in my father's reading chair for hours, staring at the walls, feeling the weight of my failure. I had been entrusted with our history, and I had allowed a charlatan with my own blood in his veins to steal it. Philip had, in a final act of condescending charity, returned the physical journal. He left it on the porch without a word. I picked it up that night. It felt violated, a holy relic that had been stripped and sold for parts. I held it in my hands, its familiar weight now a symbol of my profound loss and helplessness. It was a testament to my father's courage, and I had let it become a monument to my foolishness. Holding it, I remembered a conversation from years ago, just before my father passed. He tapped the cover of the journal. "This is more than just a story, Michael," he'd said, his voice raspy but firm. "It's my testimony. My will handles the house and the money, but this is different. This is my voice. You protect it." The memory was a fresh stab of guilt. I had not protected it. I had failed my one specific duty. The phone rang late one evening. It was my granddaughter, Chloe, a bright university student. Her voice was trembling with anger. "Grandpa, I just heard Philip on a podcast, a literary podcast. He was telling this dramatic story about how he unearthed your father's lost journal in your cluttered old study. He's taking all the credit, Grandpa. He's erasing you completely from the story." The public betrayal had now gone viral. I listened to the podcast, the sound of my nephew's smooth, practiced voice filling my quiet study. He spoke of my father with a theatrical reverence that made my stomach turn. He described me as a well-meaning but disorganized custodian, a doddering old man who couldn't see the treasure he was sitting on. He wasn't just stealing a story. He was methodically, publicly, assassinating my character and my life's work as a careful archivist. For a full day, I felt nothing but a hollow, crushing despair. I was 78 years old. Philip and his publisher were a modern machine of media and money, and I was an analog man in a digital world. They had successfully framed me as irrelevant, a footnote in my own family's story. The fight felt impossible, like trying to punch the tide. The sheer injustice of it was a physical weight on my chest, making it hard to breathe. Driven by a morbid curiosity, I went to the publisher's website. There it was, a gleaming pre-order page. The book was priced at $29.99 for the hardcover. There were blurbs from historians Philip had clearly duped, praising the astounding new discovery. They had a promotional video featuring him walking solemnly through a military cemetery. Every click was another shovelful of dirt on the grave of my father's true legacy. I called Arthur one last time, my voice thin with desperation. "Isn't there anything else?" He sighed, the sound heavy with pity. "Michael, I'm sorry. Their legal team is a fortress. They've built a narrative that would cost a fortune to dismantle in court. We would need a 6-figure retainer just to start discovery, and they know we don't have it. My hands are tied." The last door of hope had been slammed and bolted shut. That night, I sat in the dark, the only light coming from the street lamp outside. I stared at the portrait of my father on the wall, his young, handsome face so full of conviction. I felt a profound sense of shame. I had let him down. The quiet hiss of the radiator was the only sound, a long, slow exhalation of failure. I had lost. The money, the story, the honor, it was all gone. My hand fell upon the journal, still sitting on the side table. I picked it up, the worn leather a familiar, painful texture. It was the source of my misery, the instrument of my humiliation. I almost put it away, but then the memory of my father's words surfaced again, clearer this time. "My will handles the house and the money, but this is different. This is my voice. You protect it." A specific instruction I had failed to follow. What had he meant? The will handled the house. He had separated them in his mind, the tangible assets and his voice. Why? An archivist's instinct, buried under months of grief and despair, began to stir. An instruction tied to a legal document. It wasn't a sentimental plea. It was a directive. A switch flipped in my mind. I wasn't a victim anymore. I was a researcher with a primary source problem to solve. I went to the old roll-top desk, a piece of furniture I hadn't properly opened in years. The key was stiff in the lock. Inside, the air was stale, a time capsule from a decade ago. I began sorting through old tax returns, insurance policies, and property deeds. My hands, stained with the dust of my own neglect, searched for one specific file. Last Will and Testament, Robert Crane. It had to be here. I found it at the very back, in a brittle manila envelope. My hands trembled slightly as I pulled out the document, its pages held together by a rusty staple. I read through the familiar, dense legalese. The house and its contents to me, a portfolio of stocks to my sister, Philip's mother. It was exactly as I remembered. My heart sank. Had I imagined the emphasis in my father's voice all those years ago? Was this another dead end? This is different. The words echoed. Different from what? Different from the house, the stocks. I tipped the envelope upside down. A single folded sheet of paper, thinner than the rest, slid out and landed on the desk. It had been tucked behind the will itself. It was a different type of paper, with a different notary stamp in the corner. It was dated November 5th, 1988. A year after the main will was signed, I unfolded it. It was a codicil, a legal amendment, and its language was a lightning bolt that electrified every nerve in my body. It contained only one clause. With regards to all personal papers, letters, journals, and manuscripts created by me, I hereby bequeath these items and their associated intellectual property, including all copyrights and publishing rights in perpetuity, solely and exclusively to my son, Michael Crane. My father's voice, reaching across 30 years to hand me a sword. A wave of cold, crystalline fury washed over me, clearing away all the despair. This wasn't just a legal document. It was my father's foresight. He knew the value of his own story. He had trusted me, and only me, to be its guardian. Philip hadn't just stolen from me. He had violated the explicit, legally binding last wish of his own grandfather. The quiet hiss of the radiator now sounded like steam building in a pressure cooker. I read the codicil again and again, solely and exclusively. The words were iron. They invalidated any claim Philip could possibly make as a descendant. He had signed a publishing contract based on a fraudulent claim of ownership. The entire multi-million-dollar enterprise of this book was built on a foundation of sand, and I was holding the deed to the beach. My mind, the mind of an archivist, began to work with cold, calculated precision. Arthur was a good man, but he was a probate lawyer, a gentle gardener of estates. I needed a different kind of professional. I needed a wolf. I spent the next 4 hours online, cross-referencing legal journals and court records. I wasn't searching for a lawyer. I was searching for a weapon. I found her in the database of a New York firm specializing in intellectual property litigation, Evelyn Reed. Her case history was a trail of scorched earth. The next morning at 9:01 a.m., I called her office. I laid out the facts in a clear, chronological order. The journal, the digitization, the publishing deal, the specific dollar amount of the advance, and the exact wording of the codicil. I spoke not with the quavering voice of a victim, but with the dispassionate authority of an archivist presenting an irrefutable document. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then, a voice, sharp and clear as shattered glass, said, "Mr. Crane, your nephew didn't just infringe on your copyright. He committed felony fraud against his publisher by warranting ownership of an asset he never possessed. This is not a lawsuit. This is a detonation. Bedlam Inc. will not be your adversary. They will be your instrument. Their legal department will turn on your nephew so fast he'll get whiplash." Ms. Reed explained the strategy. We wouldn't file a slow, costly lawsuit. We would send a single, devastating package via courier directly to the CEO and General Counsel of Bedlam Inc. It would contain a copy of the notarized codicil and a letter explaining that any publication of the last winter would constitute willful infringement, exposing them to statutory damages of up to $150,000 per copy sold. It was a corporate kill switch. Her retainer was $15,000. I didn't hesitate. I transferred the funds from my retirement account. It was the cost of my father's honor. The publisher's immediate response will be to terminate Philip's contract, she continued, her voice devoid of emotion. Then they will initiate legal action against him to claw back every cent of that $250,000 advance, plus all their marketing and production costs. He will be ruined. The retribution was more complete than I could have imagined. She needed the original codicil to verify its authenticity before acting. I booked the first train to New York for the following morning. As I packed an overnight bag, a sense of purpose hummed through me. I was no longer a relic gathering dust. I was an archivist on the move, transporting a document that was about to rewrite the present. The house was no longer a prison. It was a command center. On the train, speeding through the winter landscape, I thought of Olivia. I could picture her sitting beside me, a small, determined smile on her face. She never backed down from a righteous fight. "It's about respect, Michael," she would say. "Not just for your father, but for yourself." Her memory was no longer a source of pain, but a wellspring of strength, fueling my resolve for the battle to come. Ms. Reed's office was a landscape of glass and steel high above Manhattan. She handled the delicate, aged paper of the codicil with a surgeon's precision, examining the notary's embossment under a light. "This is perfect," she said, looking up at me. Her smile wasn't warm. It was the satisfied smile of a predator that has just spotted a fatal weakness in its prey. They won't know what hit them. The final insult came that very evening. My phone buzzed with a news alert. A prominent national magazine had just released an online excerpt of the book. It was accompanied by a sprawling, sycophantic interview with Philip. He talked about the emotional burden of bringing his grandfather's story to life and his plans for a young adult adaptation. He was at the absolute peak of his undeserved triumph, oblivious to the guillotine hanging over his head. I sat back in my study, the train ride a distant memory. The plan was now in motion. Ms. Reed had confirmed everything. A legal courier was scheduled. The package would be signed for at precisely 9 a.m. I looked at my father's journal, resting on the desk. It was no longer a symbol of my failure. It was bait, and the trap was about to spring, silently and irrevocably. Philip, emboldened by the magazine feature, sent me a text, just a link to the article. No words, just the link. It was a digital victory lap, a final twist of the knife. I looked at the message on my phone, the smugness radiating through the screen. I didn't reply. There was nothing to say. An archivist knows the importance of letting the primary documents speak for themselves. The grandfather clock in the hall began to chime 9 o'clock. It was the evening before the letter was to be delivered. The house was perfectly still. Every object in the room, the desk, the books, my father's portrait, seemed to be holding its breath. The quiet was no longer the sound of defeat. It was the sound of a perfectly laid ambush. All I had to do now was wait for the screaming to start. The next morning, I did nothing. I made my coffee. I read the newspaper. I watched the birds at the feeder outside my window. At 9:15 a.m., I received a one-word email from Miss Reed, delivered. A quiet satisfaction settled over me. It was the feeling of a historical record being corrected, of an error being permanently amended in the archives. The wheels of a terrible, swift justice were now turning. The phone rang at 11:32 a.m. I knew it would be Philip, but I let it ring. He called again and again. Then the texts started. At first, they were confused. "Uncle Mike, the publisher just called. Something about a legal issue. Do you know anything about this?" Then, increasingly panicked. "They're asking about Grandpa's will. Why? Call me." Finally, raw fury. "You old bastard. What did you do?" I read each one with the detached calm of a librarian. An hour later, my doorbell rang, furiously and repeatedly. I opened it to find Philip, his face a blotchy mess of rage and disbelief. His expensive coat was unbuttoned, his hair disheveled. The smug literary figure from the podcast was gone, replaced by a desperate, cornered animal. "You can't do this," he sputtered, waving his phone at me. "They're canceling everything. They want the advance back. I didn't invite him in." I simply stood in the doorway. "I did nothing, Philip. I said, my voice even and low. Our grandfather did this more than 30 years ago. He entrusted his voice to me, not to you, not to our family. To me, you just never bothered to read the primary source material. The archivist's insult was the cruelest I could devise, and it landed with the force of a physical blow. His arrogance crumbled into a pathetic plea. But the money, Uncle Mike, it's gone. I spent some of it. $250,000. They're going to sue me into oblivion. Please, you have to call them off. Tell them it's a misunderstanding. The number, once a boast, was now a millstone dragging him under. He finally understood that history, my history, has consequences. I looked at him, at this stranger who shared my blood. I felt no pity, only a vast cold distance. A misunderstanding? I repeated. There is no misunderstanding. You made a fraudulent warranty in a signed contract. You built a career on a lie. The publisher is not my enemy, Philip. They are a victim of your theft, just as I was. Their recourse is with you and you alone, which brought us back to this moment a week later. Philip had arranged a final, desperate meeting in my library, the very scene of my initial humiliation. He brought his lawyer, the same silent shark who now looked distinctly uneasy. They thought this was a negotiation. They thought they could appeal to my sense of family, my sentimentality. They still didn't understand that the sentimental old man was gone. Ms. Reed sat beside me, a portfolio in her lap. She had flown in this morning. Her presence was an Arctic front that had lowered the temperature in the room by 10 degrees. Philip's lawyer began to speak, his voice oozing conciliation. Mr. Crane, Michael, we believe a mutually beneficial arrangement can be reached. Philip is prepared to offer a significant portion of future royalties. Miss Reed cut him off without looking up from her papers. There will be no future royalties. Bedlam Inc. has not only terminated Mr. Crane's contract, they have also issued a kill order on the entire print run. The books are being pulped as we speak. There is no story for your client to profit from. Furthermore, they have filed a civil suit in the state of New York to recoup the advance. She spoke with the finality of a judge. Philip's face went white. Pulped. They're destroying them, he whispered, the horror dawning on him. He hadn't just lost the money. He had lost the fame, the legacy he so desperately craved. His name would now be a toxic asset in the publishing world, a cautionary tale whispered at cocktail parties. His betrayal had yielded him nothing but debt and disgrace. This is an outrage, Philip's lawyer blustered, trying to regain control. My client was acting in good faith, based on family custom. Miss Reed finally looked up, fixing him with a stare that could freeze fire. Your client is a con artist who defrauded a publisher for $250,000 using a stolen asset. The only custom he followed was greed. I suggest you advise him to prepare for bankruptcy. I stood up then and walked to my desk. I picked up my father's journal, its worn leather cover cool beneath my fingers. I held it up for them to see. This was never about money, I said, my voice clear and steady, filling the silent room. It was about this. My father's testimony, a promise I made to him. You mistook a sanctuary for a warehouse, Philip. You saw an asset, and I see a soul. Miss Reed slid a single sheet of paper across the desk. It was an agreement, a settlement. In it, Philip would sign over any and all perceived rights to any family documents, forever. He would also issue a public retraction, an apology, for his false claims of discovery. In return, I would agree not to pursue my own damages against him. It wasn't mercy. It was erasure. You're trying to ruin me, Philip cried out, his voice cracking. This is about revenge. He looked at me, his eyes begging for the soft-hearted uncle he thought he knew. I am not ruining you, Philip, I replied calmly. Your own actions have done that. This is not revenge. It is a correction, a footnote in the historical record, ensuring the provenance of an artifact is properly attributed. His lawyer read the document, his shoulders slumping in defeat. There was no way out. The evidence, the codicil, was absolute. Fighting would only lead to a public, humiliating trial and far greater financial penalties. He tapped the paper with his pen and nodded grimly at Philip. "Sign it," he advised, his voice a low murmur of surrender. Philip stared at the paper, his hand trembling as he reached for the pen. This single signature was the formal end of his ambitions, the legal monument to his own greed and folly. He was signing away not just a book, but his entire fabricated identity as the great literary discoverer. He was being reduced, correctly, to a failed thief. The quiet hiss of the radiator seemed to sigh in satisfaction. He looked up at me one last time, his face a mask of pleading. "Uncle Mike, please, don't do this." I met his gaze and held it. I thought of my father in the frozen Ardennes forest, writing in that journal by candlelight. I thought of Olivia's quiet strength. I thought of my own foolish trust, so cruelly betrayed. I offered him no comfort, no absolution. I just gave a slight formal nod. With a choked sob, Philip scribbled his name at the bottom of the page. The sound of the pen scratching on the paper was unnaturally loud in the silent library. It was the sound of a lock clicking shut, of a history being sealed and protected, finally, from those who would plunder it for their own vanity. The restoration was complete, here in the very room where the crime was conceived. Miss Reed took the paper, checked the signature, and placed it neatly into her portfolio. "We're done here," she announced, standing up. Philip and his lawyer sat frozen for a moment, two statues of defeat. Then they rose, and without another word, walked out of my library and out of my life. I watched them go, feeling not triumph, but a profound, quiet stillness. The balance had been restored. I walked over to the large window overlooking the garden, the same window where my neighbor had watched my humiliation weeks before. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the lawn. In my hand, I held my father's journal, its weight familiar and comforting. The quiet of the house enveloped me once more. But it was not the silence of loss. It was the silence of peace. I turned from the window and closed the library door.